Morning everyone. You join me today for a one-year review of my 2011 Mercedes E63 AMG. So let's turn this camera around and get started. The story with this car begins with my previous car, which was a 2003 E39 BMW M5. I really liked that car, but I wanted something a little bit newer where it was easier to find a nice example of one, and wanted it to be a car in the same vehicle class, so a fast rear-wheel drive German V8 sedan, which in my opinion is the perfect car if you can only have one, such as if you live in a city like San Francisco where parking is really expensive. Up until this point, I'd only owned BMWs, but I was really curious about what it would be like to have a Mercedes AMG, and specifically one with the M156 motor. So there were a couple of options that I was considering at the time, such as a W219 CLS63, a W211 E63, and there's a couple of reasons why I ended up going with the early generation W212 E63. Mainly it's because there was a shift in philosophy at Mercedes AMG right around the late 2000s, just before this car came out, where they transitioned from simply putting big engines into their cars to focusing on building the car as a complete package, making it handle well, and really competing with BMW M. Of particular note on this car is the front suspension setup. The front track is 2.2 inches wider than the standard car and uses coil springs instead of air shocks like in the E550, as well as a quick ratio steering rack that's much more communicative and much quicker than you would find in the standard E-Class. In addition, this car also got the MCT transmission, which first debuted on the 2008 SL63 and uses a wet clutch instead of a torque converter for much faster shifts than the torque converter version of this transmission. The upshifts are basically instant, and the downshifts, while not quite as fast as the upshifts, are still very quick, and the car blips the throttle and feels like the transmission is well suited for the car. Once I decided that I wanted a 2010/2011 Mercedes E63, there was a question of which one in particular to get. And it's kind of tricky with these because they didn't make very many, only 2,400 cars for the North American market. And it was just after the recession, so most of these were made in pretty conservative, boring colors like black, white, or some shade of gray. Nothing wrong with those, but I wanted something a little bit more interesting, so I actually searched through a database of every car of this model ever made. And this is one of 3 made in Designo Mystic Blue. It's a custom order color, and in my opinion, it looks gorgeous in direct sunlight. I ended up reaching out to the owners of those cars, and this guy in Ohio actually agreed to sell me his car. So here it is now in California. I've already been doing a walk around of this car, but I wanted to focus a little bit more on some of the design language of this car. I think it's a beautiful blend of 1980s and modern design cues. Overall, the boxiness of this car reminds me a little bit of the W124 AMG Hammer from the 1980s. And I also really like this pontoon rear haunch on the side of the car. It was actually a little bit controversial at the time, and Mercedes got rid of it for the facelift version. I don't think it looks that great on the standard E-Class, but on the AMG version with the wider front track and the aggressive side skirt, I think in general this is a really, really good looking car, and all of the design language works beautifully. The only thing from a design perspective that I did not like on this car as it came from the factory were the stock tail lights. I think it's because I have a blue car, but the red made for a bit too much contrast against the paint, and so I installed a set of these clear tail lights that look aftermarket, but they're actually OEM, as you can see from the Mercedes logos imprinted in the lenses there. They were made in very limited numbers, and I had to track down a set from Denmark used because they're no longer available new. I think they're really interesting because Mercedes hasn't really made a set of clear taillights for any of their cars as an aftermarket accessory before or after this car. And so I think they're really interesting for that reason. I also happen to think that they look great. My fiance thinks they look a little bit tacky, so I'll let you make your own mind up, but I'm a huge fan. Moving on to the inside of the car, the blend of 1980s and modern continues, starting with these bulky AMG seats that remind me a lot of the 1980s Recaro seats that you would find in something like a wide-body SEC, with the side bolster controls on the bottom of the seat. And in general, there's a lot of very angular design language in this cabin. There's also some old school touches such as the clock and the gauge cluster that's taking up as much space as the tachometer. I don't think it's the best use of space, and clearly Mercedes agreed, because for the facelift version of the car, they completely redid the gauge cluster and got rid of the clock. There's also a foot-operated parking brake, which was last seen on this generation of E-Class, and up until then, Mercedes had used this in their cars forever. And the last piece of 1980s ergonomics here is this cruise control stock that was first seen on the W126 S-Class from the 1980s. It also happens to move the turn signal stock a little bit lower than you would find it in most other cars. It's kind of interesting, not the best ergonomics, but certainly a very old school Mercedes feel. Overall, I love the design language of this cabin. I think it's a great place to be, and I love the spec of it too, with this panoramic roof, the carbon fiber trim, and the gray interior. It makes for a really spacious cabin, and these seats are some of the most comfortable seats that I've ever sat in. All right, I think it's about time I start this thing up, and one last note before I do is that this engine has 518 horsepower from the factory and 464 pound-feet of torque, and to my ears, it's the best sounding engine of all time. So enjoy the cold start and the exhaust clips. All right, so how does this car drive? In short, I think it delivers everything you want out of a high-performance German sedan. It's comfortable, but it also handles well, and it's fun to throw around in the canyons. It's big, but not too big, so you don't really have issues parking this car in the city, but it's still spacious enough for you to be able to take on a long road trip. And all the materials feel really great. I think that's one of the things that people sometimes underestimate about these high-performance versions of normal mid-size sedans like the E63 or the M5, is that even though it's kind of the same car with a bigger engine and more performance parts, it actually feels elevated on the interior as well, where, for example, the headliner is full Alcantara. There's leather everywhere on every surface, basically. And even though it still looks the same as most other E-classes on the inside, it feels more premium, and it's something that you don't see in pictures as much, but you can really sense when you're sitting in it. As far as the engine, the handling, and the transmission go, the engine is great. I mean, this is probably my favorite engine of all time, as I've said before, save for maybe the M159 that goes in the SLS AMG, which is just a slightly more refined version of this very engine. I think it's got great power, it's very responsive, and it sounds awesome everywhere in the rev range. Like, it sounds great when you're just sitting in traffic and it's rumbling away at idle, when you're driving around town and it's short shifting around 1200, 1300 RPM, and especially when you're in the canyons and revving it out to 6500 RPM and you can hear the crack as it shifts into the next gear. It's a really, really fun engine, and I think it really makes up the character of this car, or really any car that it's in, because Mercedes put it into a lot of cars. The transmission is good, but not great. I think in terms of getting a car with this engine, there's not a lot of cars that they made with good transmissions. All the other ones were 7-speed automatics that didn't really shift all that quickly, whereas this one shifts quickly. It's got a little bit of lag when you pull the pedal, between the pull of the pedal and the actual shift, but then the shift itself happens really quickly. And similarly on the downshift, it can't go through gears quite as quickly as a dual clutch or a modern 8-speed ZF transmission, but it still blips the throttle on the downshift, and it can downshift nice and quick. One of the things that lets this car down a little bit, as it comes from the factory, is that it doesn't, most of these cars did not come with a limited slip diff, and I recently installed a limited slip diff in this car, and it makes the handling just that much better, where if you drive it with the traction control off, the back can step out a little bit. It's very predictable, and the handling of this car at the limit is really great once you put a limited slip diff into it. The other thing to remember too is that this car is relatively cheap for what it is. At the time that I bought it, which was just over a year ago, in April of 2022, I sold my E39 M5 with 130,000 miles for $31,000 and bought this car with 56,000 miles for $30,000. And I think that even if I was to buy a contemporary M5, like the F10 M5, it would have still been around $10,000 more to get one with the same miles as this car. And really, I don't see why. I think the reason, if I had to take a guess, I'd probably guess that for Mercedes AMGs of this era, there's a little bit of a stigma that they don't really handle all that well, and that it's just a normal big sedan with just a big special engine in it. And I think this car is so much more than that, where at least compared to an E39 M5, the handling is as good, if not better, than on the E39 M5. In fact, I'd say that the precision of the steering and the feedback through your steering is better on this car than it is on the M5. In terms of the way that the car feels mid-corner, the E39 M5 feels a little bit more compact and a little bit more tossable than this car does. But this car feels more stable and more precise and offers more feedback. So yeah, I don't know how much more there is to say other than the fact that this has been my favorite car that I've ever owned, and it's the only car that I felt like I could really see myself keeping for a long time, because I don't think that there's anything better that's come out since this car was released, at least based on what my priorities are. I like a car with a big naturally aspirated V8 engine, and this was the end of the line for that engine. In fact, in 2012, the E63 got the updated 5.5 liter twin turbo V8, and that's still a great engine, but I think that it's not quite as special as the one that's in this car.
And on that note, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching. Hopefully you found this helpful. Maybe you learned something new. If you did, please leave a like and have a great rest of your day.